Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started and we'll let people trickle in. Welcome everybody, and thank you for deciding to spend your time here with us today with Rubicela Gamboa, who's going to be talking about surviving segregation and racial violence, understanding the historical Chicano experience. Before we go any further, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. She has her bio on the screen here. You can follow along if you'd like to as well. But Rubicela Gamboa was born and raised in the Yakima Valley as a as a daughter of farm workers. She is a first-generation college student and earning her AA, her transfer degree from Yakima Valley College. She got her BA in history from Eastern Washington University and a master's degree in Mexican American Studies from the University of Arizona. She is currently an associate professor and chair of the American Ethnic Studies Department at Ventura College in Ventura, California, teaching history and Chicano studies. And I will say one other thing that I know about Rubicela is that she created a DTA of Chicano studies for Ventura College just recently, and that just I think is a huge accomplishment. So please help me welcome Rubicela Gamboa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to be able to come back to my hometown and to speak to you today. I'm honored for this opportunity. Before I begin, however, I would like to make an acknowledgement. I would like to get started by taking the first step in removing a colonized structure of false ownership and acknowledge that the Yakima indigenous peoples and culture are the original inhabitants of this land and continue to be its caretaker. I would also like to recognize that Yakima Valley Community College is situated on Yakima traditional homelands, territory that was taken illegally and violently. It is understated to say that many lives were terminated, including women, children, and the elderly. The effects of settler colonialism continue to take the lives of Yakima peoples at a staggering disproportionate rate, and specifically that of young girls and women. A one-sided historical narrative has systemically shaped and regulated the relationship that exists to largely accommodate an accepted dominated succession to inferiority inspired by white supremacist ideals over Yakima resources and Yakima bodies. Today, I will cover the Chicano experience, which is rooted in the identity we acknowledge within our indigenous ancestry and relationship we have with our Yakima Native brothers and sisters. And so we stand in solidarity. I encourage you to engage in learning more about the historical existence and resiliency of the Yakima Nation and their fight for self-determination and education. There is a call to action to change our thinking around structural racism and build and establish relationships and real trust that empowers our youth through the hiring of faculty, administration that has a lived experience of the Yakima peoples. I myself express humbleness and gratitude for the opportunity to have lived, studied, and worked and participated within this community. Tlaxacomati, aho. So thank you again for this invitation and this opportunity to share this information to the campus and community. The title, some of you may have thought, whoa, that's a pretty intense title. And maybe some of you may have thought, why are we focusing on the past? Should we be focused on the present and moving forward? My response, if you did happen to think that, if that crossed your mind, is that historical trauma is similar to how a doctor cares for their patient. The patient has sustained critical injuries and the doctor doesn't just sew them up and give them some medication and say, you're good to go and you're healthy and strong and able to be productive in society. In order for there to be any restorative healing and positive change through collaboration, if we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we must first acknowledge and assess the damage. I am presented before you as a professional within my field of study, speaking on Chicano experiences. I would like to bring your attention back to what's said in my bio as the first generation and daughter of farm workers. And I'm sorry, I forgot to click my slide here with the acknowledgement, the land acknowledgement on the land that we're on of our Yakima Nation. Going to me being a first generation college student and growing up in the Yakima Valley as a daughter of farm workers, there is a history here. There's an attitude that exists in our society. There's an experience as a Chicana growing up as a daughter of farm workers that shares with you at a very young age what racism, what discrimination is, what it feels like, and not knowing or understanding why. All you know is that you're not being treated equally, you're not being talked to equally, and you don't feel that your parents are being treated any better. So as a child growing up in the Yakima Valley, I know that this story isn't unique, and it's unfortunate. But for me, it was what empowered me to continue, because I felt like I need to know the story. Why? Why are people treating us this way? Why are people thinking about us this way? Why does social media have this attitude, right? It was an inspiration for me to continue my education, to find out the why and to understand it so that I could come back and I could change it. So the beginning of this land acknowledgement and the introduction to Chicana and Chicano identity, it goes hand in hand with our roots. Most of the time in American history books and in social media, you see the map on the left. It's clear, it's evident that this was indigenous land. We have indigenous communities that thrived and existed, but we kind of forget about the one I'm sorry, the one on the left is the one I was talking about. The one on the right, we kind of forget about that one. South America, Mexico, Central America, heavily indigenous population that existed and thrived before European invasion occurred. And unfortunately, when we have those invasions that occur and we have the splitting of the nations in half, we have a westernized thinking that's introduced and splits our identities and splits our consciousness and splits how we used to function in communion and used to have connection. So from there, I want to go into, well, Chicana, Chicano, right? Some people really don't even understand what that means, of Mexican American. How is that connected with what I just talked about indigeneity and indigenous roots? So most of you are familiar with Aztec. The Aztec are the people that the Spaniards come into contact with and end up having a conflict and war over land ownership and entitlement over the society that thrived there. Here is a map. Right in the middle is where Tenochtitlan was, of where the Aztecs lived and thrived in their civilization. However, we don't call them Aztecs because that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves the Mexica. Now, Mexica is an indigenous word. It's in the Wat word. Mexica means the belly button of the moon or belly button of the maguey. And Mexica is what the Spaniards eventually would call the people, all the people, as Mexicanos, where we get Mexicano and get Mexico. So what is Mexica? What does that mean, the belly button of the moon and the maguey? Well, speaking with elders and trying to understand this idea, this concept, it's like every person that exists, we have a belly button, and we were at one time connected with the source of life, which was our mother. In this case, the belly button of the moon and maguey is our connection to the creation, our connection to the earth, our connection to the sky, our connection to this creation of this earth. So Mexicano, Mexican, essentially means that we are where we belong. We belong to the creation. We're part of this world and the earth, connected to Mother Earth. So next time you think about that, of Mexican. Now, Chicana, Chicano, we bring this back, this concept of Mexica back. Doesn't mean that all the indigenous populations were Mexica. They were not. However, the influence is heavy, and the identity then becomes part of just the indigenous identity of being native. So Chicana, Chicano, whether you spell it with the CH or the X for the Nahuatl language, what that is it's bringing us back to understanding this connection of indigenous roots. So the Chicano movement brings that title in as a reflection of that. So the Mexica people between 1325 and 1345, they founded this city, this capital of Tenochtitlan on this Lake Texcoco. And the story that they have is that's not where they originated from. They didn't all of a sudden start in this time frame. Their history goes back millennia, and their story goes back to a place of Aslan. And so there's several different scholars that have talked about, well, where is this? Some people would say it's a mythical. One thing to understand when we're studying the history of Chicanas and Chicanos is that unfortunately there's been a narrative that is not an indigenous narrative, and it's a westernized view that does not take into consideration many of the elders' perspectives and stories. So you have to really look at this information with a critical eye when you start to do your own history and investigation. So the concept of Aslan and what Aslan is, Aslan was their homeland where they say they originally came from. The Mexica were people who migrated. They migrated south, and they say that they came from the northern region. There's lots of evidence as to where that region is, which is identified as the Four Corners region. And in this case here on the map, there's specific archaeological places that are within the Hohokam region. The part of this region, they've also been identified as being Chichimeca. So some indigenous people will say that maybe they're not Mexica, maybe they're Chichimeca or other tribal affiliations that they may have or know of their connection. When we look at the society, the society that existed reflected on the land ownership of taking care of that land, not borders or boundaries in the way that we look at them today, but sustaining people through a way that was natural. And population that existed on this place, on this island, was 350,000 people. But that's not what's really impressive. It's the extension of this society, the power that ruled over 300 city-states, 100 client states, which in total was 15 million. And these stories are being presented within 500 codices. Unfortunately, many of the books were burned when the invasion occurred, thousands of books in the libraries, but these codices will give us a glimpse, and do also take them with a grain of salt, because most of the codices that are there were written after, under the influence of Spanish priests. Now, when we look at our societies today, obviously we see that our indigenous connections are pretty much just removed, buried, right? Literally buried. In this case, this is Mexico City, where it is actually the city of Tenochtitlan is buried under the city. The indigenous connection is not evident in the way that societies function. And we see that globally. This is not just within the Chicano experience. This connectionness, I want to bring it home, because it's important to understand of how we're connected to the land and how we're connected to the community, going back to a place that within that Hohokam area of a community that was thriving, had agriculture, sophisticated urban centers, and this trading network. And within most indigenous communities, people, when observing them or studying them, they think that they were in silos. They lived there and they didn't talk to anybody else. They were just there. And that is not true. There's a lot of evidence to the connection of networks. Matter of fact, most highways that exist were indigenous roads before they became highways. The biggest one is the I-10, the I-10 freeway that goes from California all the way to Florida, which was a natural indigenous pathway that connected Native communities. And then also the evidence that exists of the connection with the South, all the way up into what we call as the United States and the Southwest. Finding that connection. And not only that, finding artifacts, but the landscape itself showing and showcasing this interconnectedness of 225 ball courts that exist in the Southwest that connect it directly to the Mexica and the Maya populations that existed in the South. So with this, there's unfortunately changes that occur, climate changes, lack of resources that create a migration of people and populations that move. But what is evident is this connection that not only through evidence that is found today, but the origin story of Mexican American and Central American people is like of the Jews, as a story that is rooted in an ancient language and shared an ancient culture. And here you have maps showing you through language of where we can see that that connection actually exists, and also shows and shares of this connection that was thriving in the past, and unfortunately through our borders has been severed. So as I move forward, and unfortunately I am moving really quickly, there's a lot of information and hopefully I get through it all. So I apologize for not going into specific details, but here we have the map of what the Spanish invasion looked like. Now, one other misconception here is that, oh, all of the yellow meant that there was Spanish control. That's not true. You have many indigenous communities that continue to thrive independently and still do today. However, it does show you, though, how European nations claimed ownership over land. And there was movement of those communities and living in those areas. This is hundreds of years before we see the English come in, before we see the French come in. So it's a Spanish dominated area for quite some time. And when we start to look at the mapping of our lives and the mapping of our societies, we need to debunk the ideas of inferiority. And most of those are that, oh, well, people weren't sophisticated, they couldn't fend for themselves. And honestly, that's not true. If we really do investigate the history that occurred, the Spanish invasion was seeing some significant defeats. And it wasn't until the real culprit, the real danger came in, which is the germ warfare. And before, and I used to teach this and talk about this to my students, you know, they kind of try to think about it and try to figure out what I meant by it, and sometimes even struggled with this. But now that we are in this era of COVID, I don't think that this is difficult at all to understand, of the fear, of the tragedy, of the unknowing, of the chaos that a disease that you do not understand and that is killing your community rapidly would cause. So this is what takes place of and happens when there's European contact with the communities. And this is also evident within our Yakima Nation, another history that we need to also look into. So an estimation of a 90% decimation of a population, which was an ethnic cleansing through germ warfare. But the idea that exists here is the same similarities of what's happening with us today. You know, you feeling symptoms, you know, did you get, now we have a COVID shot, right? That we're relying on to protect us, but there was no medication, there was nothing. So unfortunately you were ill and that was the end. So from that, what we see is that when you have communities that are broken, that have been riddled with fear, you have then European nations who take advantage of this opportunity and come in and burn down villages and cause confusion. So unlike the romantic story that most people have of Mexico and haciendas and these rich landowners and you know, this love story that's usually shared on novelas, it's quite contrary to the actual experience of the majority of the people that existed there. The indigenous people are identified on the rosters of each of these what are called encomiendas or missions or plantations, they're identified as chattel, their property. So in essence, what's not talked about and what's not shared is that when we're talking about the indigenous community, and what occurs is that we have a people who are captured and enslaved, a slave labor that is introduced. And so you have people who are enduring the backbreaking labor, the poor nutrition, the racism, the harsh discipline, and the punishment and sexual violence against their bodies because of them being indigenous. So these ideas are rooted, right? And then they become a process of thinking in a psychological way of thinking about yourself and your identity. Because if you're not at the top as a peninsular or as a Creole, then you don't have any right. You don't have rights. You can't speak. As you get down further down this pyramid here, the mestizo, which is a person of mixed ancestry of Spanish and indigenous, you start to see the less and less value that you have in society. And also the African presence, the slaves that were brought in. And there's this mixture that occurs within the Mexican Chicano identity, becoming buried as being insignificant and inferior. So this is the root, right? This moves us into, well, how we identify ourselves and the levels of identification that exist within the Chicano community. A misconception that has plagued our people and Mexican communities is that some people will say, oh yes, I'm Spanish, right? Or I have, I'm European descent. And the data doesn't really show that. When you look around the regions, I'm sharing with you here the census from Northern Sonora region. It's sharing with you clearly for centuries that you had indigenous people who still continued to be the thriving population in the area and not that of European descent. So because of this mindset that's introduced, right, of a inferiority to your color, right, the colorism, you have people, in this case, famous governor of California, Pio Pico, who was able to experience Mexico under the ownership of Spain and independently, and then as the United States takeover. He identified himself as a Spaniard of Spanish ancestry. And it's interesting that people look at him and they go through his ancestry of identifying him as he was an Afro-Mexicano. He had African ancestry, but yet did not choose to identify himself that way because of the way that society had reflected anybody who had indigenous ancestry and African ancestry. So the concept that was pushed heavily within the Spanish society and Mexican government was to mejorar la raza. This was actually a real concept that was introduced specifically through the Catholic Church of marrying up, is what they called it, right? Believing that the white race was superior. In the cases of this, the intermarriage shot up vastly because of these concepts, because if you had children that were lighter skinned, you were giving them a better opportunity to be successful in life. So from here, this colonization, this foreign ideas of who has ownership of land, who is powerful, it continues as we see the war, the Mexican-American War, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. We have an immediately communities, people that are transformed in their citizenship overnight. On the map on the left is showing you how indigenous peoples are split in half. They're removed from the areas that they used to be able to go to freely and be with their community. They're now identified as Mexican. And then you have Mexican families up in the northern area that now are have the choice of becoming United States citizens. And so immediately transforming, and then this border now identifying them as something else. So in an instant, through the Mexican-American War and after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you have an influx, a migration that is vast. The storytelling, the narrative that we have is a false narrative that it's just empty space, right? A place of discovery. Like the way that it's introduced historically is very, it's in a way that produces white superiority and that thinking that a race is here to claim ownership over an area that is not developed, which was not true. So because of this concept of an instantaneous overcoming of a population that feels already that they have superiority over the land ownership, and claiming of that is going to lead to the violence that occurs. So you have your Americans, Central Americans, rapidly coming in. The idea is that it's only European, which is not true. And that's what also creates this conflict within identities and violence, is that who's gonna get this? I thought this was for Americans, but yet we have people coming in from all over the place, and other nations trying to take a piece of the pie, especially during the gold rush. So unfortunately, yeah, if you haven't seen this movie, maybe your parents have, but this is a romanticization of what happens to Chicanas and Chicanos, the Mexican American communities, once the United States has taken ownership of the territory. And the Tombstone movie, you know, it makes these characters great. It makes you want them to be successful, like you're just excited for them. And it's, the story is very different, the truth. When we look at what's really happening in the area, the power that exists is not necessarily as the movie depicts, of these outlaws, right, just creating havoc, but it's mostly the building of policing is to police the people who don't want to get out of the way, which are indigenous people and Mexican Americans. So you have families that existed in what was identified in our history books as an emptiness. You have indigenous people that existed. And in the 1840s, what immediately happens is that you have laws that are put into place. You have ordinances. In this case, and when we look at Texas, because Texas was annexed first, you have the annexation of Texas and the immediate response to, well, what are we doing with these people who are in the way? Well, we cause fear and intimidation, and we pass ordinances to not allow them to move into our towns. So there was actual ordinances not allowing for Mexican Americans to travel into specific counties, and also ordinances passed that Mexican Americans could not communicate with African Americans for the fear of them organizing and uniting against them. So there's 200 families that were identified that were pushed out of what was now their homeland and the United States, and pushed into Mexico, areas that they did not live in before, and now we're having to call home. So there were refugees of the United States being pushed into Mexico. And the policing that occurs and is presented is a volunteer process. You know, how many volunteers can we get? And having posses up to 500 men who their real goal was to go and cause intimidation and circle around the families out there in their farms, and burn up their barns and whatever, killing family members, anything that could be done to push out these people from their positions of political power and ownership of land and resources. So eventually we have a takeover of 80% of the population, of the professional field, of the mercantile, of the government positions, being done so through fear and coercion. And you even have, doesn't matter if you were somebody who was in elite class, people like Juan Seguin, the captain of the Texas Army, a hero of San Jacinto, somebody who helped Euro-Americans fight for the annexation of Texas, was then immediately pushed out. It didn't matter that he was an ally at the time. So a Mexican is a Mexican, whether you were married up or had European ancestry or not, and during this time with Americans. So what we see around the United States, and specifically in the Southwest, and the takeover and the ownership of this property, is passing these laws, as I mentioned. And we know that many Mexican and Native people had communal land. Under the Spanish laws, there was indigenous communal land that was in ownership of property by Native people communally, not just by one family. And so Congress passed a land act, and this land act was to have a hearing and to show you have to prove your title. So they forced these families to prove you own it. The hearings were held in English, knowing that these communities were Spanish-speaking communities, and you have Spanish and Mexican titles that were reviewed and determined if they were valid or not. There was 813 that ended up coming through, 520 going through the process, almost bankrupt towards the end because of all the fees and fines or whatever that was paid for lawyers and whatnot, of having this approval being taken care of. You also have the judges, the juries, the land commissioners. All of these people were easily bribed during this time. You know, when they talk about this lawless place, it was, and unfortunately it was actual government that was lawless, because they were causing the harassment, they were causing the intimidation. And what this is you have a structure of racism, right? The government was causing the racism, the government was causing the barriers that is evident and rooted moving forward as the United States within each state and within each territory that it then conducts business with people of indigenous ancestry. So to further make matters worse for people, what you had was called Greaser Act. And that's, you know, unlike, you know, the John Travolta films of, you know, being greaser and being cool. That's not what it was during this time. A greaser was somebody who greased the axle. And at this time, you have Mexican Americans that were not being allowed to excel in jobs. They were not allowed to be hired in skilled labor, and were being pushed into different lower tasks and not getting paid as much. In this case, because it was greasing, they ended up calling them greasers. And it didn't matter if you were married up, didn't matter if you had a white husband or a white wife. Again, you were seen as somebody who was in alliance with the indigenous people, and then the white people were then also attacked as well. The Civil Practice Act that was introduced because of this concept of this idea of who has what kind of job and what they should be doing. You have an introduction, what's called the Civil Practice Act, that was introduced in the Southwest and in California, where it prohibited people from actually testifying in court. So you were being denied due process, you were being denied your civil rights. You even had legislation that was passed so that everything would be in English, and that you had to have your own translator if you wanted things translated. And so this Greaser Act that's introduced is introduced to create criminals of indigenous people, of Mexicans. If you didn't have a job, if you hadn't been looking for a job within 10 days, you were considered a vagrant. You were therefore then arrested. And as you're arrested, those condemned by the law were able to be hired out by folks in the community. Say, hey, I need some people. And they would come and hire, they would pay the jail, not the person. So what this was a creation of slave labor, a law that was introduced to make Mexican indigenous people criminals and then sell them out as slave labor. And this happened all over the Southwest. So and again, as I mentioned in Texas, you see this in California where Manuel Dominguez, one of the signers of the California Constitution, was denied his civil rights by not being allowed to testify in court because of his indigenous ancestry as a Mexican American. So the violence here in the background here, this is a real photo that was turned into a postcard. And the postcard was shared among Americans in the Southwest and sent back to the East to show that the problem of the people that existed here was being taken care of. The violence was rampant. Between 1848 to 1928, you have 547 Mexican Americans that were being lynched in the United States. Now, this is an estimation. The way that the numbers were received was the historians were looking through newspapers, so manually searching through newspapers of every single town that they can think of. And whenever somebody reported a lynching of a Mexican American, it was recorded. So you can imagine how many were not talked about in the newspaper that are not put in here. So the competition for trade created this violence, created this this fear, this idea that we have now today of people taking jobs. But in this case, we have a migration of people who entered into a homeland and then switching it, causing this fear of this competition. And the competition existed because of the attitudes that were being perpetuated onto Mexican and indigenous people. You have violence that's happening, and more so on the border. There was an unequal economic condition that existed, and the Mexican government on the Mexican side recognized this immediately and put sanctions and safety nets for the Mexican people on the other side in the United States. So they tried to help them by allowing them not to pay fees or taxes. And the people that were coming in that wanted to monopolize the area, such as families such as the Stillman, the Kings, and the Kennedys during this time, they were seeing this as a huge threat. And therefore, these people paid individuals to use as muscle to fight for them to remove the competition, which is what we end up getting is this policing, the beginning of policing. So the policing was for the resources, the silver, the lead, the wool, the beef tallow. If you don't know what beef tallow is, manteca. We're all passing through this process here. And so La Zona Libre was an attempt for the Mexican people to try to help those that were on the other side. And the response was the Texas Rangers. So I have a video clip here of a Texas Ranger that I'd like to share. And I hope that we can hear it.
I was coming up Military Road with Colonel Hickok, and they came to some big mesquite trees, and it was full of Mexicans hanging by the neck. The colonel says, "Peavy, I guess the Rangers have been through here."
What this is showing you is the attitude, right? That you have this officer who's the way that they feels at the time, during the time of this, the beginning of the century, sharing that it wasn't anything big, right? He's laughing about it. That I think is the truth to how the attitudes of people were during this time. Being Mexican, living as a Mexican in the United States was something that you needed to really be careful of who you told or who knew that you were Mexican, who knew you had indigenous ancestry. On the left here, there's a New York Times editorial that was reporting on the crimes or it was hate crimes. It wasn't talked about as hate crimes, but that's what we would identify it today as, the killing as intolerable. You can see it right there in the middle. It says intolerable. That these acts were being done on a regular basis. So fighting discrimination marked you as an outlaw. If you were defending your community, if you're like, hey, you know, this is wrong. What's going on here? There shouldn't be this violence that's occurring on my people. You have people who eventually become identified as Mexican heroes and heroines of this time. And our history books will identify them as bandits and as terrorists even. You have, I don't have here, but you have the Mangonistas, the Magon brothers. You have Joaquin Murrieta, Juan Cheno Cortina, and then Josefa. Josefa was one of the first women who was lynched because she fought against a white miner who tried to rape her. These are the people who are trying to defend themselves, defend their bodies, and then attacked and criminalized. So you have the fighting of discrimination marked you as an outlaw and as a terrorist. And this occurred regularly, causing many families to seek refuge and also changing their identity. This is why you have many Mexicans who will say, I'm Spanish, right? I have Spanish ancestry, or no, I'm not Mexican, I'm Spanish. And this is to blend in, to not see any of this violence occur. So in April of 2016, at the Bullock, Texas History Museum in Austin, they now have, this is a picture of that video that we just watched. And it's showcasing finally the violence that occurred and the truth when you want to look about the Wild West, like this is the truth. This is what needs to be talked about. The marking and the acknowledgement of violence by the state and the institution as institutionalized racism on Mexican families. So the Chicano experience has continuously made headlines, but doesn't seem to make it into our history books. The lack of acknowledgement has been by design, excluding our narrative, and it's buried in obscurity. And when it's done intentionally, as it has been, to deny the rights of people, deny the information, that is institutionalized racism. And that is why when the title is said, and we're talking about trauma and addressing that trauma, the problem is that it hasn't been addressed, right? That's why the doctor needs to do immediate surgery on the situation and cannot just patch you up and say, you know, here's a lollipop, thank you for being a great patient. It's not like that. There's so much that people don't even acknowledge or understand in order to change the behaviors that exist or identify where that stress, that damage needs to be assessed. So the segregation that happens at this point, so if you're seeing Mexicans being hung, you're seeing posses being built and fear being pushed, you can only imagine what the children are experiencing when they go to school. So the segregation that occurs, you have children who are feeling inferior, children who are being pushed out, regulations that are being pushed into the institution as the no Spanish rules, the dietary health habits of the food that is allowed to be brought to school, or the food that is introduced to the children is not reflective of the culture that exists. And then knowing that the Pledge of Allegiance was changed. It used to be Pledge Allegiance to my flag, and instead now they changed it to the flag. The IQ testing that happened of young students, most of these families, as I mentioned, these were Spanish-speaking families because the area was Mexico. The people spoke, that was the official language before the United States came in. And that's part of the culture and the heritage from the invasion of Spain. Unfortunately, many of these families, because of the slavery that existed, were not allowed to continue their traditional native tongue. And as I mentioned, the ones that do and have thrived are the ones that did not face that invasion and continued to have self-determination on their own. So the IQ testing proved time and time again in the United States that Mexicans were made for lower end jobs because they were scoring lower. And they weren't being assimilated into white America. They were still maintaining their language, they were still maintaining their culture, and that was identified as being backwards and lack of intelligence. So what happened in our school systems was the tracking of youth. They weren't being talked to, they, about being professionals, getting skills, or even attempting to speak to them to go to college. The tracking system here made many and pushed out many and put them into these lower end courses that they actually called mentally retarded courses. We, thank goodness we don't use these words anymore, but that's how they were identified. So in 1925, you have Mexican Americans who were saying, this is just a bunch of baloney. There's no way that this can continue. And you have people who challenge it. They create the tests, translate them, give the tests out, and you have the scores going 70% higher. And matter of fact, doing even better than most of the white Americans that were taking these tests. However, even when this is introduced and it's shown that the students did in fact do well, there wasn't anything done for the rest of the classes. There wasn't anything done after that. It was just like, oh, that's interesting, right? Well, next, what's next on the agenda? And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, I just showed you that we shouldn't be tracking our Mexican American indigenous students. Like, did you not hear what I just proved to you? So the de facto and the de jure segregation. So the de jure segregation is where you legally are allowed, right, to enforce separation of students. And then the de facto is the segregation in public schools that refers to the situation in which schools are attended predominantly by one race. So in this case, for many years, Mexican Americans, for the purposes of segregation, were then identified as white. So then they weren't segregating them if they put them into an all Mexican Indian school, because they were the ones that were white. They were allowing for that, to be legal. So this was a loophole that was done for a really long time. So the segregation was not tolerated by Mexican communities. One of the first desegregation court cases is Maestas versus George Shone. And here you have, this was actually just recently discovered here in 1914, where Francisco and Margaret Maestas are parents of their children, want their kids to go to school, are not allowed to go because they are Mexican and need to go to the Mexican school. So there's a lawsuit that's done. This is in Colorado, and the school district said that they were dividing the children as Mexican and as Americans. So they weren't identifying the children as American. It was said so in the reports in this court case. The district did not identify the youth as Americans. And they were separated by language, saying that there was a barrier and they needed to work on that barrier before they could be put with the American students. So the families boycotted the schools. Families took action. For months, they worked on this, and the ruling delivered that in this case that it was off of racial prejudice that this was happening, and had the district change its policies. So a commemoration has been done in Colorado, where this bronze sculpture now is being introduced to showcase this critical decision that was made to allow students to be able to be treated fairly. The segregation is around the United States an issue. You have Roberto Alvarez versus the Board of Trustees in the Lemon Grove case, where this is a Superior Court case that ruled in favor of the Alvarez family. And you also have the first successful federal court case of Mendez versus Westminster in 1946. In this case, you have what was identified as the violation of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, that the children were being separated, and it was not equal, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, it was not equal. The schools, the materials were inferior. The teachers were not even certified teachers. There were teachers in training. It was just a hot mess that they were expecting Mexican youth to continue in. And what this case did is it paved the way for the one that we all know is the Brown versus Board of Education. But even after Brown versus Board of Education, there was a loophole, because in Brown versus Board of Education, it talks about Black and white. And in this case here, Mexican Americans were being considered as white. So therefore, you still see the continuation of segregation in specific communities that tried to use this loophole. So what we have here is a fight, right? People who were trying to fight for the rights, the violence that's existing, the children who are not excelling, this future is being limited. The process of trying to excel in our society was done so intentionally to not move them forward. And you have organizations like the Mutualistas, the Aid Society, during the Mexican Revolutionary period and into our current societies. So the revolutionary self-help, self-defense, demanding democracy in the workplace, and Mexican workers were paid unequally, and identifying that. And so from here, we also have the movement of women organizing, mothers, Emma Tenayuca in Texas, Luisa Moreno, a Guatemalan, Josefa Fierro from California, who were organizing all around the United States, in urban centers, in rural areas, striking, looking for ways to address the wages, address the positions that were being offered, and the pay, right? That's still an issue. So again, when we're talking about the trauma, we can't move on. The wound is still there. The issues are still there. The segregation still continues. As a matter of fact, when I went to school in Toppenish, I used to pick up the attendance, and one day I was walking around picking up attendance, and this one room was acting real rowdy. I could hear them. I was like, okay, the teacher must not be in there. And I peeked my head in. I saw all these kids that I knew. They were my friends. And I'm like, what class is this? It looked like fun, right? All the kids that I knew that I hung out with. And they're like, oh, this is the ESL class. I'm like, ESL? I'm like, well, why are you in this class? Like, they didn't even speak Spanish. I'm like, why are you in this class? It didn't make sense to me. Their parents are Mexican Americans. They were born in the United States. They were born in Washington. I'm like, why are you in this class? And it puzzled me. And I walked to the principal at the time. And as I went to put my attendance down, and I said, I need to talk to you about the class. I think these kids are in this class and they shouldn't be in there. The principal just stood up, grabbed my shoulders and turned me and kind of slowly shoved me out the door and said, teachers know what they're doing. And that for me was a critical moment in me wanting to understand what's going on here. So for people to think that, oh, the civil rights took care of everything, there's no segregation, there's no this, no, the wound is there, it's continuing. So the activity of organizing and the ideas that are enforced are introduced all over again. Here you have Herbert Hoover, who was talking about America for Americans. Sounds a little familiar, right?
Hey, Ruby, not to interrupt, but you have 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. So the ideas of who America is for leads us into this idea of violence, of segregation, of who and where people belong. There's a history of moving and removal and denying people of rights, repatriations, massive deportations that occurred. 2 million Mexican and Mexican Americans that were sent to Mexico for the fear of them taking American jobs, right? 60% of that 2 million people were Mexican Americans. You have stories that are told from all over the Southwest, specifically from Pacoima and San Fernando. My husband's wife, that would be me, my husband's grandmother, she grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and she grew up during this time. She shared that story. She shared the day they came, volunteers and city officials came in their trucks and buses to knock on people's doors and rip them from their houses. She said that she locked the door. She was a child at the time. She was with her siblings, taking care of them while her parents were at work. And she locked themselves in and she put them in the bathroom, and they were sitting in the tub until they heard the screams stop, until they heard people, the yelling stop. And they finally came out to see who had been taken. And this is a Mexican-American family living in the United States with this fear of being removed from their house. So when we're looking at this, these ideas, they go deep, they go further. And I'm unfortunately, I'm gonna have to skip some of this stuff here, but I want to bring it to where we get about movements of the change, because I don't want to leave you in the down of the violence and the segregation, but the actual movements that have taken place because people identified with it. People started to address, well, what is it? We need to talk about it, right? What's the issues on our campus? What do we need? What's the issues in our community? How can we address them? And this is where you have our mentors, people who have taken action and moved forward. And this Chicano movement, the Chicano experience, it gives us this opportunity to access. You know, some people will say, oh, you know, great job. And then they'll say, yeah, I did it all on my own. And they'll do this whole, like, I did it all on my own. It was me, it was me. No, you are standing on people's shoulders. People paved the way. There was lives that had to be given. There was so much that you have to acknowledge. Yes, you are the one working. Yes, you are the one that's doing that work, but the opportunity for you to be here and to do that was through others that have paved that way. So going to my experience there at Yakima Valley Community College, this is an old picture here of us chilling Mecha. I was involved with Mecha as a student activist, and on our table there, we had one Chicano studies course, and only one of the books was one that we were reading. All of those books there on that table were books that previous Chicano students had purchased on their own and had left behind for us to continue to share knowledge with other students, because these were not being provided in the library. We couldn't find these books anywhere. It was like gold, right? And sharing that information. And not only were we sharing that information, but we were taking this into action. Here you have the first peace march that happened in celebration of Cesar Chavez, that was done in collaboration with Yakima Valley Community College. And myself as a student and faculty were ones that helped organize this. This was huge for our community, and the participation in it as a young Chicana, it elevated me. It highlighted my presence in my community, and it highlighted my existence as being able to create change and to participate, to work with people, and also finding leadership in the community and finding mentors. So I have a list here of mentors that I had while I was in Yakima and going to school. At the top, you have Tomás Villanueva, who became a mentor for me and many of the students in the Yakima Valley and those involved in the Chicano movement. And you have an event that's coming up, and hopefully you can attend that, because learning about who Tomás Villanueva was and the significant impact that he had is truly an amazing thing to know and to understand. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. I'm sorry that I didn't get through everything. And unfortunately, it's just, that's the Chicano experience, right? It's just so full and there's just so much information. So I'll leave it there.
Wow, Rubicela, thank you so much. People don't know that Rubicela is my sister. I'm so proud of you for sharing what you shared, because it helps me grow as a Mexicano, as a person in this community. That have value, have a history. Thank you for sharing that. We want to open it up to anybody that might have questions for Rubicela. I know that we're at our time. but we want to go ahead and give people that opportunity. So feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, and we can go from there.
Luisela, thank you for being here. My name's Liz, and I, especially today, I cannot stop grieving our babies in Uvalde, and having you come and share and show us to ourselves. And like Vicente said, just show us like our struggle and our humanity is super powerful. And thank you for recognizing too that so much of this is not just our history, but our current present day struggles still. And also thank you for sharing like your very specific local history with YBC and with the Valley and with those leaders. Those names are wonderful to see together. So just, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. That means a lot to me. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Rubicela, this is Maria Cuevas. On behalf of my Chicano Studies class, I want to thank you also for sharing this amazing information. We don't have a Chicano history course. I try to cram it into about a 2-week period at the beginning of my Chicano Studies class. Dina, good to see you. But
we need to get one.
Huh?
We need to get it.
Right. See who's here, Carrie and anyway, I wanted to say what I tell students too, and whatever else that you can add as well, that I remember seeing a quote by Marcus Garvey who says, a tree without its, people without the knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. And I think looking at this extensive history that you've shown, and we can continue it to today, because I remember when I first came here after the Sessenbrenner bill was passed, students held a walkout out of Ike and out of Davis, and march organized, this was in the days of MySpace, and organized a massive march. The police estimated about 7,000 people supported the march. The Yakima Herald, on the other hand, said it was only about 4,000 people, but you can do the math. And this was against this really aggressive immigration bill. We've also had immigrant raids here over the 15-year period that I have been here. I've had students whose families have been disappeared because federal agents dressed in black had gone to their homes looking for somebody, and the next thing they know, they're not in the home, and they find them later at the detention center. So a lot of the history is still ongoing, and I think what is important is that we understand that we need to know this history so that we can be prepared and be aware about how we can, that there is this history of struggle, that we are not passive, but that we are resistant, and that we continue to fight, but we can only fight with the knowledge of this information. So I just want to thank you so much, because this filled in a big piece of the puzzle here for the class that I have currently. I've asked any questions from you all that I'm asking my students. They're a little shy, so if we get a question, we'll come back.
Okay. I think what you just said is, like in the beginning, I'm saying people want to say, oh, why are you going to dwell on the past? Let's move forward. Why are we talking about that? That's so damaging. And the damage is if you ignore it. The damage is if you act like there's nothing going on, right? There's a historical trauma that people just don't know what the root of it, right? When you know the root, it empowers you, because it's like, okay, well, I know where the leak is. Now I can fix it, right? But if you don't know where the leak is and you're drowning, how you gonna survive?
Maribel has her hand raised. I think you have a question, Maribel. Feel free to.
I do. I do have a question. Maria, I didn't know you had your students there. So I wonder, Ruby, you were long ago where it's like the students in Maria's class. What would you say to them now? Like if you could go back and tell them something yourself, what would you say to them?
That's a big one. So What I wish somebody would have told me was you can do anything that you want as long as you believe that you can. Your dreams can come true. The opportunities are there now. We've had people who have fought for you to make that path. We're professors now, we're deans, we're counselors. We're in those circles where you will find us, you will see us, and we will help. We will put our hands out and bring you forward. Sorry. I didn't have that. I didn't have me there to come and do a presentation like this. That didn't exist. So it was a struggle to make it to this point. So as a student there at Yakima Valley Community College, I know your struggle in the Valley because it was my struggle. Look at all the people that you have around you. We had one Chicano counselor, and he wasn't my counselor, but he was the one that I would go to. We had a faculty member who was not my teacher, and he is who I would go to, right? So having these people around you now, take advantage of that opportunity that they're there. And when you're looking at your career, don't think of the money, think about what's gonna make you happy. What are you gonna be excited for every day to wake up and go to and do that, right? I know you have pressures on your family, commitments. Some of you are probably even working to provide for your family, but the burden is not yours. It's time for you. Who are you? What's your identity? What's your calling? What's your purpose? And what's your passion, right? That's what we work for. You're gonna run into faculty that aren't gonna treat you the way that you should be treated. Don't let that discourage you. They're going to mark up your paper. They're gonna maybe say something negative to you, and it's gonna make you feel like you don't belong. That's not true. That's them, not you. You have every opportunity that you can to move forward. And I wish somebody would have been there to be that person and share that with me.
Ruby, thank you so much for sharing those words. Your workshop with us here today. For all you that stuck around, thank you for being here with us today. I think we can just keep going if we wanted and make this a 3-hour thing.
This was like the tip of the iceberg. There's curriculum. There's all kinds of classes that you can take on this and learn so much more.
For sure. And for that reason, we're going to go ahead and honor everybody's time, let everybody get to where they need to be. And maybe we'll have Ruby back to our campus to continue sharing her knowledge with us. Thank you once again. It was great to see everybody. Ruby, thank you again. We will be in contact.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Best wishes to you.
Bye.